Hi, colleagues. Sorry for the delay. Hi, welcome, everyone. My name is Benjamin. I lead the innovation facility here in New York, and welcome to another innovation conversation. We're really excited today to have two different presentations that are clearly linked. With UNDP entering in a new phase, as you know, UNDP is no longer coordinating the UN system, but has the mandate to play the integrator function. That means to support governments and other partners in making sense of the complexity of the Sustainable Development Goals and thinking through how can we address development challenges no longer in isolation in one vertical, but really make sense of a system of interconnected challenges, problems, and opportunities, and think through spillover effects and trade-offs. And in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, UNDP is committed to drive all of them through innovation. Of course, there's one specific Sustainable Development Goal on innovation and economic growth. So what we'll do today is we'll dive into first what works to drive economic growth through innovation, what works actually to support entrepreneurs, including social entrepreneurs, in a meaningful way, with a presentation from our friends from Endeavor Insight. And then we'll pivot slightly because we want to make the point it's important to understand the innovation ecosystem. It's important to understand its components and think through the best possible intervention. But how do you embrace systems thinking practically? In the second presentation, with our friends from Forum for the Future, we'll dive into one specific New York-based example on making systems thinking practical. And then in the afternoon, for all of you who signed up, and there's still a few spots left if you'd like, we dive into a couple of practical tools. So without further ado, we'll have two back-to-back presentations and only have questions at the end. I'd like to introduce Red Morris and Lily Turok from Endeavor Insight. Super excited to have you here. Thanks so much for taking the time. And can you just introduce yourself, and then we get started?
That sounds great. So in the interest of time, I'll just say that Lily and I work on the Endeavor Insight team doing research on how entrepreneurship communities come together all across the world. And today, we are joined also by our colleague Maha, who works here in our office. And Lily and Maha, just to be totally transparent, did most of the real work in this presentation. I'm just the figurehead who gets to stand up. But we're going to share some work that we did looking at entrepreneurship communities in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia that was sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Just a quick note about our team. We're the research division of Endeavor, which is a nonprofit that supports high-growth entrepreneurs across the world, now in more than 30 countries. All of our work is designed to answer three questions. One, how do entrepreneurs scale individually at their own companies? Two, how do they scale collectively in ecosystems or networks, whatever metaphor we want to use? And three, what is it that other decision makers can do? Policymakers, aid organizations, donors, what can they do to support more entrepreneurs in individual communities to reach scale? And we've done work not only with the Gates Foundation, but with a host of other friends across the world. So today we're going to show you some research that we did that's from a methodology we developed with partners at the World Bank and a number of other organizations that we've actually worked with a number of academics on and that we run in more than 24 cities across the world. If you want to know more about the methodology, we're going to circulate a copy of the report to all of you following this meeting. Plenty of information about that and a lot of topics that, because we're a little rushed for time, we won't be able to touch on quite today. The target industry we look at here are what we're going to call them tech firms. You may hear me call them software firms. What we mean by that specifically is that these are companies that work in software development, in e-commerce, or in fintech in these communities. And the communities we're looking at are in Dar es Salaam and Kampala, two rather smaller cities, smaller kind of not quite as productive tech communities. A number of slightly more older, a little bit more productive tech communities in Lagos, Nairobi, and Dhaka. And finally looking at Bangalore, where we see a globally globally top-tier entrepreneurship tech community. So we interviewed actually more than 2,000 entrepreneurs across these 6 cities directly and collected additional secondary data on things like their work experience, their educational background, the investment histories, et cetera, on all of those firms plus an additional 2,500 markets. Project question that we wanted to answer was how can decision makers, and that could be donors, aid agencies, foundations, policymakers, how can they empower local entrepreneurship communities to become more productive? And by productivity, we're talking about economic growth, we're talking about job creation primarily. We're going to focus today on two of those communities. And when we looked at the productivity communities, we found that there were two at either end of the distribution, one highly productive, one not quite as productive. So the first community we looked at was Bangalore. Bangalore, as I mentioned, is a global tech center. The tech community there developed as an offshoot of the BPO sector, kind of in the 1990s. Today, it's been incredibly successful. There are a number of what we call boomerang entrepreneurs, natives of India who've gone off to work or study, in some cases even in Silicon Valley, and have come back to start technology firms. We see involvement of the top global venture capital firms like Sequoia and Tiger, making investments there. We actually see relative to its size, there are more than 3,000 entrepreneurial tech companies in the city. There's actually very low participation by things like incubators and accelerators. And very interestingly, it's one of, as I've said a couple of times, it's an incredibly productive urban tech center. One of the, it's created hundreds of thousands of tech jobs for people in the community and around India. It also, we've seen substantial tech exits. One of the largest exits that happened in 2018 was when a local company was bought for $16 billion by Walmart. That was called Flipkart, the Amazon of India. So incredibly interesting example, especially kind of from a developing or emerging market sort of context. We can also look at Nairobi. Nairobi's a slightly different story. The tech community there developed out of coming out of the early penetration of some digital banking initiatives, and Pesa is something I think a lot of you probably heard about, and developed through a great deal of donor funding. International foundations, aid organizations primarily. There's a significant presence there of expat entrepreneurs, a lot of impact investors, and it's more than we've seen anywhere else in the world, an incredibly high presence in incubators and accelerators. So I think we found there was one incubator and accelerator program for every 30 tech companies in Nairobi, which is an amazingly high ratio. And interestingly, though, there's a large portion of new support programs, so it's a very important example for us to look at to see how new models that are being spread all over the world work, because many of them were started in Nairobi before they were spread to other places. It is a tech center we see that's not very productive in many ways. So the key here to take away in these two stories, and this was true of a number of the communities we looked at, was that entrepreneurship communities are not predestined to follow a single development path. Oftentimes people talk about one community as being an earlier stage version of another, and that's not necessarily true. We see here that these two communities look very different. Bangalore, when it was the same age as Nairobi, or the same size, the number of companies, did not look anything like the network in Nairobi. They're very different organizations, very different types of businesses being built, radically different types of connectivity. So these two communities are not following the same development path. With that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Lily, who's going to take you through some of the deeper analysis that she led on these communities specifically.
Thank you. Okay, in the interest of time, so yes, won't do any introduction, but I will put right on. So we know that entrepreneurship communities are not predestined to follow a single development path. So because we care about job growth and economic development, what we really wanting to know is, okay, but where is the productivity generated in an entrepreneurship community? And what you'll see is, in any place, including Nairobi and Bangalore, is that there is a really, really high percentage of companies. So companies on the left, jobs they create on the right in the chart. So very high percentage of these companies are low productivity micro businesses, up to 3 employees at most. And then there are some other firms. And most of the jobs that are created in these places are coming from the other firms. So where is the productivity generated? Well, if we highlight companies that reach significant scale, so get to a level of kind of 100 employees or more, here's what you'll see actually here. It's an even smaller percentage, but they create a really, really high percentage of jobs. So if we ask the question, then where is the productivity generated? You'll see that a small number of companies that reach significant scale are the ones that generate a very large share of the productivity if you measure it by number of jobs. So one of the very important takeaways, if you go home today, remember this. And then this is also true by volume. For the interest of time, again, I'm gonna skip this or we can come back to it in the Q&A, but there are 500,000 jobs generated by these companies in Bangalore. On it. So, based on all of this, we started to see, as we were going on with our research, a couple of interesting patterns emerge in both Nairobi and Bangalore, and then largely. And then these patterns, which are, I want to say, quite alarming, were actually triangulated by another data source, the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative, or GALI, which collects data on accelerators and incubators and their impact around the world. And this it's a great data source for us. So what we saw, first of all, is that most of the entrepreneurship support organizations in these entrepreneur communities target early stage and low productivity micro businesses, which is not great news because we just noticed that it's the companies at scale that are generating most of the jobs. So what GALI found is that 50% of these companies accelerating, 50% of companies entering accelerators had no revenues in the prior year, and nearly 40% had no employees whatsoever. So the second interesting pattern that we saw was that the magnitude of growth in the supported micro businesses tended to be very small. So you could say that, okay, they select very small companies, but they're very good at helping them scale. Does not seem to be the case. So as a trend, companies that were participating in accelerators only grew by an average of 1.3 new employees and like $6,000 in sales after completing these programs. So, and then the third thing is, this is my least favorite thing about accelerators, is that they often don't recognize when young companies have the potential to scale. And it's quite telling that actually the majority of the fastest growing entrepreneurial firms in the places that we studied and GALI studied were rejected from these programs. So while the typical accelerator can help low productivity startup businesses make very slight improvements, many are unequipped to really assist entrepreneurial firms with the potential to scale and increase local productivity. Okay, so we now understand that it's very important to pay attention to scaling companies because they are the ones that are generating most of the productivity. But what is it that they are really doing differently than everybody else? So we tested a bunch of things, and then a couple of really important features emerged. And I promise we'll come back to this in the Q&A, but 4 things really mattered. The first thing was the amount of work experience that the co-founding team had collectively before starting their company. If they had 20 plus years of work experience, they were a lot more likely to become a top performer among companies of the same age. Then work experience matters. The second thing that really mattered was the quality of that work experience. Where did the co-founders work before starting their companies? The third thing was getting support or mentorship from a founder that had previously achieved scale with their company. The fourth thing, investment from a founder who had previously successfully scaled a company. So what is it that they really do differently than other businesses? These top performing companies were much more likely to build relationships with founders who already achieved scale. So connections seem to matter a bunch, and networks seem to matter a bunch, networks among entrepreneurs. So how do the networks affect productivity in an entrepreneurial community? So this is a social network of the entrepreneurial companies and other organizations who work with them in Nairobi, the social network map. And I'm gonna give you a couple of guidelines to read it. So every company and organization is represented by a circle, entrepreneurial companies in blue, other organizations in gray. And by entrepreneurial company, what I mean is it was started by an individual or a group of individuals, but not another company or government. So the size of the circle represents the number of connections that are originating from this organization or entrepreneurial company, but it has nothing to do with the size. It's their influence and how it's represented, and every founder or leader of an organization is represented by the organization or the company. So it's just organizations and companies. And then there are 3 colors. I don't know how much you can see, but you can probably see that it's a colorful cotton ball. But the blue arrows are experience, so former employment at a company or an organization, or serial entrepreneurship, so somebody started a lot of companies. Orange, mentorship or program participation, and green, like the color of money, angel investment or venture capital. So this in total kind of gives you a sense of what the Nairobi entrepreneurial community looks like. So in comparison, this is what Bangalore looks like. Very different. But let me help you with a couple of the key differences in the two entrepreneurial communities. So the first thing is you'll see that the biggest circles, in one of them in Nairobi, they're gray and they're blue in Bangalore, suggesting that the most influential actors here were leaders of incubators and accelerators, whereas the most influential actors in Bangalore were the founders of entrepreneurial firms. Right, we'll get back to why that's important. The second thing is that if you highlight the organizations and companies where the leadership includes someone with leadership experience at a company of 100 employees or more, this is what the scene looks like. So you really have to squint to find those in Nairobi, and it's really, really common in Bangalore. And in comparison, if you highlight the organizations where the leadership doesn't include anybody with any entrepreneurial experience whatsoever, in black, this is what it looks like. So first of all, it's very common, so it flips, and it's very common in Nairobi, very rare in Bangalore. But secondly, it's actually the really big bubbles are highlighted in black in Nairobi, suggesting that actually often the most influential organizations are like that in Nairobi. They don't have anybody in their leadership who's ever led or built a company. So how do networks affect productivity in an entrepreneurial community? The patterns of influence really shape the development of the entrepreneurship communities. I'm gonna pass it back to Brad to put some numbers on exactly how much.
Okay, so if we quantify what Lily has visualized for all of us, what we'll see is that there's 3 types of connections: experience, investment, and support. And the sources of those connections, give the same colors: black for having no entrepreneurship experience whatsoever, and this yellow or gold color being for having experience running a company that's scaled to 100 more employees. We see there's a great deal more of that experience coming from Bangalore in terms of experience in companies that have scaled, much less of that in Nairobi, and in its place, a great deal more experience among people who've never been entrepreneurs themselves. And that's important because when we did the analysis across all the cities we looked at, we saw that having a connection from someone who has sort of experience of scale increases the prevalence of the companies receiving that connection in terms of top performance relative to their age cohort by more than 2x. Interestingly, in Nairobi, or anywhere across all of the communities we looked at, having a connection from someone who'd never been an entrepreneur, being mentored by someone who'd never been an entrepreneur yourself, actually caused a significant decline in performance or the relative rates of top performance. So ultimately, we found in this analysis that when founders at scale are more influential in an entrepreneurship network, an entrepreneurship system, entrepreneurship community, we see that community becomes more productive in terms of creating economic growth and job creation. So a few things to know about influence. We know that influence in networks is relative. So if you can influence 10 or 12 people, that might sound like a lot, especially if the average person in your social network can only influence 3 or 4. But if the average person in your social network can influence 100, 10 to 12 isn't quite so much. So influence, the size of influence matters kind of in the network it's embedded. So when these donors came in and they elevated the influence of these incubator accelerator programs led by people without entrepreneurship experience, they were actually, on a relative basis, decreasing the local influence of people who did have experience and who had led companies that had scaled in the local network. The other thing to think about that's really important for networks is that hubs in networks, whether it's social networks or kind of electronic networks, are highly persistent. Once something becomes a hub in a network, it is likely to stay a hub in the future. So some of these agents or some of these foundations that set up the initial accelerator programs have actually stopped working in Nairobi, but the organizations that they elevated to be hubs have continued to be hubs even in their absence. And so when we work in networks, we have to always remember that what we do may last a long time after we even leave the intervention. So a few takeaways about how decision makers can empower local entrepreneurship communities. The ultimate finding of the whole report is that decision makers should elevate the influence of people in the community who've led companies that have had the sort of success they want to see, that become productive, and incentivize them to connect to upcoming founders. We think about that in terms of approach, which you can read about in the paper, is just having more a bottom-up style approach versus kind of a top-down style of approach. We talked about why there's two approaches, why one is much more important than the other. Specifically, when we talk about implementing more of a bottom-up entrepreneur-led development approach, there are a couple of things that we identified across successful communities that we're part of. The first is to avoid the myth of quantity. So a lot of people working in entrepreneurship communities say, what we need in this community is we need more startups, or we need more organizations, or even we need more connectivity. That did not seem to be supported by what we see in these communities. More startups just produces more micro businesses that themselves are not very productive. More connectivity actually makes the people who are most successful less connected because they are less likely to connect with each other. They are more discerning about who they're going to work with. More organizations often ends up elevating people who don't have experience as entrepreneurs, decreasing the influence of the people you want to be influential. The key question we suggest that decision makers like yourselves ask when having these sorts of conversations is, who will the program we're working with, who will this be elevating in the local community? And what are we telling local founders to value if we support this program? Second thing we identified is to follow the lead of local founders who reach scale. So oftentimes, my background's in government, the kind of local level here in the United States, and the mayor I worked with in a city in Louisiana wanted the city to become a hub for digital animation. Well, we didn't have any digital animation companies. We had a couple of professors who taught digital animation at the local university. The entrepreneurs themselves hadn't identified digital animation as something that people in the community could do. The policymakers wanted to get in front of the entrepreneurs and lead them to a new sector. That doesn't work. What works is when policymakers or decision makers follow entrepreneurs and say, what have entrepreneurs already figured out works here that we can kind of accelerate, that we can catalyze further, rather than deciding what's going to work here ourselves. Entrepreneurs, you can think about, are the most valuable economic development researchers in any community. Every day they're going out running experiments, trying to figure out what can grow in this community. And if we look at the results of those experiments, we can get the best data in the world. So the next thing we identified was it's important to listen to the fastest growing firms in the community if you want to understand what the real constraints of the local ecosystem are. Because when you're talking to any entrepreneurs and you ask them, what are your challenges with growth? You'll get feedback from them, and there are two competing hypotheses for why that's a challenge. In the first case, this could be challenging for that company because of the capabilities of the individual entrepreneur. They just aren't very good at going out and raising capital, and that's why their company's having trouble raising capital. The second case, that raising access to capital could be an actual constraint of the broader environment. If we are surveying and talking to the people who are building the companies that are going the fastest, the likelihood that this is a constraint of the entire community rather than the individual capability of the entrepreneur is greater, because these are people who are at the forefront of kind of the network and pushing the constraints. So at the very least, when surveying entrepreneurs in the community, it's always important to segment out the fastest growing founders to see how they report challenges that their companies face versus others. Two more. There are existing mechanisms in any entrepreneurship community that has some sort of productivity where founders are kind of helping others to grow. And that typically we see it involves mentorship and support through sorts of organizations that are led by founders who've reached scale, or early stage investment. And once we can find these mechanisms, which are very common, they're commonly similar across most communities, there are things that can be done to incentivize more local leaders to engage in these activities. And anything we can do to do that is going to help companies or communities become more productive. And finally, in the interest of time, trying to go a little fast, There is a unique opportunity when we do have a situation like Nairobi, where the hubs in the community are led by people who've never run an entrepreneurial business. We can't change the fact in any short period of time that those are the hubs in the network. But what we can do is transform the character of the hubs themselves. And so what we talked about with some leaders in Nairobi is there's a great opportunity to invite entrepreneurs who have scaled to become leaders on the boards of directors and in other ways of the programs that are the biggest hubs in the community. And therefore transform those hubs so that they're spreading more of the information, more of the practices that are associated with scaling. In the interest of time, that's all we have for now. When we get to the Q&A, I know Lily would be glad to answer any more of your questions about this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks, Red. I encourage you to write down your questions. And just to frame the discussion we have after this, 3 quick points. First, for UNDP, entrepreneurship plays a crucial role in advancing development, in advancing job growth, and also entrepreneurs have a double bottom line. Profit and impact. Social entrepreneurship is a concept that UNDP increasingly supports. And not only to drive economic prosperity, but to solve other problems across the SDGs. The times when we could assume that the brightest minds are within a UN organization or the government are long over, and going out and tapping into the creative potential of entrepreneurs, of innovators, is just the right thing to do as one tool in the toolbox that we have in UNDP and that we highly promote. The second point is, I like to quote an impact investor out of Kenya, Orio Kola. She said, there is no innovating out of bad leadership. And this is where we also come in to think through what are things that innovators should and can take on, and what's the responsibility of the government, and where do we have to hold the government to account and work with them on better infrastructure, on better policies. And that's an important message to underline, particularly for us in UNDP. And then thirdly, it's essential that we in our endeavors to support particularly social entrepreneurship through a program we have with Impact Hub, for example, Accelerate 2030. I encourage you to check out the website where we support acceleration-ready social ventures across the globe, or our youth leadership programs, that we reflect upon lessons we just heard from Endeavor Insight, because many of those findings directly apply to many of the contexts that we work in. And this is the pivot over to Rodrigo. When you intervene in a complex system, you might have positive consequences, but also sometimes negative consequences. As we saw in Kenya, the influx of massive grant funding, for example, did not always have positive implications for the entrepreneurial communities in Kenya. So and with this, we're going to pivot over to Rodrigo, zooming out of entrepreneurship and into what does a complex system constitute of, and how do we work with that? Rodrigo.
Excellent. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Rodrigo. So I'm going to go quite fast. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction of what system change is, and a little bit about Forum, but also not stopping too much because we have to run. Essentially, the 3 objectives is like introduction to Forum, a little bit of theory of what system change is, and we're going to have a session later after this talk where my colleague Jordi is going to have a teaser of what we mean with system change, and then share a case study, which is the COLA. So we're an international NGO. We've been around for around 22 years. We focus on sustainability and creating system change in 3 particular areas. Energy, 1.5 degrees, radical decarbonization is one. The second one is about sustainable nutrition and food, how we're going to create food by the 9 billion we're going to be by 2040 in a way that is delicious, that actually is reducing carbon emissions, etc. Regenerative agriculture, all those kind of things. The third one is about value change and sustainable livelihoods, how we're going to really start to create a better distribution of wealth in different ways. So we have those 3 main areas and different projects around each of them. We essentially believe this about system change. Now, and this quote is quite important for us in terms of what Donella Meadows actually suggested in theory around system change. Is like we really don't understand the world sometimes like this, but when we do, sometimes we also act very differently. We are in a completely different way to that. And from that perspective, well, I'm going to jump this one up just for accelerating time. But just a brief definition of what we mean about system change, and we're going to be sharing the slides. Not that we can. I'm going to be sharing the slides with you, but this is a little bit of the definition of how we're seeing it. Is for I think one way to understand it is a process. So system change has different tools, things that help you to coordinate an ecosystem, to create transformational change, but at the same time is the result of creating that and using that process. So it's a process and it's an outcome. So this is the definition that we have there. And how we're testing this, we created the School of System Change. It has been there for 18 months. It's going to be next summer, 2019, this number 6 base camp. Base camp is like kind of the condensed course where we teach these 5 different capabilities around system change, which are leadership and learning. How are we evolving our leadership, moving from a vertical way of seeing leadership to a really more collaborative style, more horizontal. Systemic diagnosis, really part of what they were showing, Endeavor, Red and Lil, thank you very much for that, to really try to understand what is the ecosystem and understand who's doing what, how, and when. Strategy design, really thinking longer term, using futures. Innovation for impact, a lot of design thinking, things like you're starting to use acceleration, and then collaboration and engagement, really nourish that. So those are the 5 principles. And then I wanted to share this with you because you probably can see it, but again, we'll share it. But essentially, these notes, these 5 are the 5 capabilities. But then underneath, what you can see are, or behind, different frameworks that are being used for applying them. And that's partially what we review in the school. So for instance, if you zoom in here, a little bit, collaboration and engagement and design and leadership, we have here design thinking, human-centered design, a normal process for rapid prototyping, ethnographic led methods, etc., etc. So the range of frameworks that are used to create and think systemically is a little bit of a map, of a collection, almost a repository where you can do. And what we're going to do now, I'm going to show you very briefly one that we use for understanding how change happens and what it means to create transformational change is that one that you can see there, multi-level perspective. Have you heard about the multi-level perspective before?
Aspects, yes, maybe not apply to here.
Perfect, excellent. Well, that's good that you have. So we have one, yes. So, and we're going to go through a story about what actually the rock and roll story tells us about change and how change happens. Okay, so think about this story about change, and let's see what you can start to identify. I'm going to give it a play. Hopefully, it will work. So immediate reactions. What do you think? Quick reactions, anything about change, obviously.
Acceleration of change.
Acceleration of change. Okay. What else?
Some of it's just driven by external factors and just responding to them.
Yeah, different factors. Good. So essentially there, what we introduce is the multi-level perspective essentially looks into 3 different levels of how change. So imagine here's a timeline, and that goes increasingly in that direction, and you have landscape, regime, and niche. So on the landscape level, we have different things happening, Great Depression, racial discrimination, World War II, baby boomers, suburban living, etc., etc. So all this was happening in the wider, bigger context. In the middle, you have the regime. So the regime are more like the mainstream, who are setting up the rules of change. So you have the recording industry, distributing industry that were doing things and business as usual. But in the third level, and this is really interesting because also what we've been hearing is the niche, the margins of the mainstream, who's creating change and how these guys are creating change. So here, imagine these are the microphone, electric guitar, things that were happening, almost like the startups of those times. And this process is really interesting because when you start to see that change and that acceleration, eventually that penetrates the regime and it starts to move into a different direction. It's almost like a course correction. So that's a very brief version of the MLP, which is one of the tools that you're going to be using later on today. And then I'm going to zoom in to New York. Who lives around the L train? One hand up.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
That's the
Well, they're going to be a little bit affected. So, do you know essentially the L train is going to be disrupted? I'm going to share 3 learnings by telling you what we're doing. So a little bit of action listening or active listening, please. Like, these are the 3 learnings. And as I'm telling the story, please try to capture what do you think I'm telling you these 3. The first one is systemic ventures, which essentially that one is really starting to understand. And this has been a process that we've been going through in terms of, normally we tend to think about a project or a pilot is with 1 or 2 partners, is in a limited time-bounded situation, and is resourced in a specific way. It's almost like it has limited to the budget, etc., etc. But here, the point about systemic ventures is to start to think, how can we start to think and really change our paradigm to move from that position of limited resources, limited partners, etc., to something that we start to think we need to understand the ecosystem, how the ecosystem is going to be acting, and be part of that ecosystem, not seeing it like those particular partners could join us, but actually we're part of that ecosystem, and where we did that particular people, depending on what is the industry, what is the global goal you are going to be working on, how you can be part of them, and understanding the second thing, which is rather than seeing the time bounds, you actually understand that this is a long journey. I mean, we're in a hurry, right? Like, we have 12 years to really fix. By 2030, we obviously got the IPCC report, etc., etc. So, and then the third thing is, when you start to think like that, then we start to also understand that there are different ways of funding the innovation that it needs to happen. That's going to be transformational because you can partner with public sector, with foundations, with private entities, with venture capital funds, with angel investors, etc., in a way that we haven't done it. So that's the first one. The second is about mapping the ecosystem. So you heard a little bit about that. So I'm not going to go much more profound on that. And then acting. So system change, when you start to take the big picture, can be paralyzing. And so how do you move from the macro to micro? And it's really important to move fast and act and start to take the first step. So those are the 3 learnings. I'm going to share the project a little bit. So the background of why we're doing this, within the 3 challenge labs I mentioned, the 1.5 degrees, the food, and the one about value chains, we have like a particular interest on reduce carbon emissions, create a carbon positive economy within this one, the 1.5 degrees, and around mobility. The mobility system creates globally 30% of the carbon emissions, and also within cities, 7% of the carbon emissions are coming from spaces like this one, like New York and these mega cities that we live on. So all the things that you know. How we started. So we started like last year, we collaborated with Dell and Open Data Software, City of Palo Alto, and Nero, to start to understand how open data has changed and effective mobility, sustainable mobility in cities. So we had that kind of large questions, and through that research, we started to connect with who are the main actors, what they were doing, what were the main challenges, who was doing what, and really start to see the different pain points. Well, we did that. We presented that to the mayor office, and the mayor office invited us to present during Open Data Week to say, can you present this? And we said, we would like to do something a little bit more acting. So can we put these insights into action? So what we did is we ran a design sprint, a session, which is like a hackathon essentially. We brought all the different agencies, so that DOT, NTA, Tax and Limit Commission, Port Authority from New Jersey and New York, and we asked them to give us or share the data. So because it was Open Data Week, the idea also was like, can you share your data? And put the data there with over 100 different data scientists. You have people, experts in mobility, experts in sustainability, representatives from the community. The idea was to have an interdisciplinary, almost anti-disciplinary type of situation where everyone was sharing from their different perspectives. So that gave us like 10, 11 different ideas of assessing what was needed in the system. First of all, and more important, the framing there was like MTA and DOT, believe me, they're doing a lot right now to mitigate the flux of how many people. What we were saying is how many people need to move from Brooklyn to Manhattan. What we said is we want to ask the question from a sustainability perspective. What is going to be the environmental, the social, and the economic impacts that are beyond just moving people from A to B? Okay, so that was the question that the guys did, and the context obviously is being closed because Sandy flooded the tunnel that you can see there, and actually super dangerous. We shouldn't be using Bell and then the Carnegie Tunnel. It's really, really dangerous. And then you have the trend that we see by 2050, 70% of the population is going to be living in cities, et cetera, et cetera. This thing that I already mentioned, and really the urgency, So scientists are already obviously trying to create a new level of hurricanes, So the category number 6, which is going to be on top of 200 miles per hour. So the Port Authority said, we know there are going to be more challenges. This model is really interesting for us because it's how can we learn about what can we do to mitigate this in order to replicate it later, and use technology in that way. So obviously they decided to close it. Just a little bit of context, 400,000 people use the L every day. 225,000 are the ones that are going to be specifically affected because they moved from Brooklyn to Manhattan. That's roughly the size of Pittsburgh. And the trend also is ridership has tripled since the 90s. And essentially it's a really large challenge, a specific challenge around mobility. This is the disruption. So you can see from Bedford Avenue where the interruption is going to be happening. It's really interesting because for us, this is starting to create a different set of solutions. Even the city, some of the streets are going to change how the circulation is. It's going to grow the bike lanes, or the bike paths are going to grow, et cetera, et cetera. So we saw this as an opportunity. I started to create how might we questions, and how might we questions are innovation questions that help you to understand where it can be an intervention. And the first one was essentially from the perspective of the material reality of the impacts that New York City is going to have in their residents. How can we use this as an opportunity to enable sustainable behavior change and sustainable mobility? What can we test, and how can we learn through that limitation to potentially instigate a new behavior and hopefully sustain it after? So the second one is how can we foster participatory design? This is very important for us from a perspective of being inclusive and equity, really integrate and open spaces like the hackathon where people can come and share their own issues and replicate it. So one thing that for us is very important, especially to the scale that we're thinking as a global NGO, is that what we want to do is to document this the best we can to go and replicate. So I was presenting last month at LA, a mobility event, and LA already has a disruption that's happening in a similar way. And they were already interested about it. Paris has a similar type of collaboration. So the replication can be an important element. And then how emerging technologies affect the change of mobility. So what we did is we created the L-Train Co-Lab. The L-Train Co-Lab is a collaborative and open innovation space where we're curating 4 different interventions around the L-Train shutdown to enable sustainable mobility. And I will not touch much on this one, but essentially this is kind of think about the big part of the system to a specific intervention where you can act and you can control and you can learn a little bit more and move two main things that we're doing: learning pilots, 3 to 4 pilots that we want to launch to mitigate that impact, and exponential impact, which is essentially the replicability element, an open innovation process that we want to capture and then share. So these are the 4 interventions: multimodal travel and communication, remote working and underutilized resources, entrepreneurial neighbor communities, and the strategic planning and real-time data. Going very quickly about that. So the first one with multimodal and travel communication, one of the issues is like a lot of people don't know how their community is going to be affected. They don't know if it's going to be half an hour, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, where they have to go, what are going to be the new routes, etc. So there's an opportunity there to provide information. But how can we provide information that helps them to take a healthier decision, a decision where they actually potentially can say, if you walk from here to here and then you use the bike and then you use this bus, you actually get there a little bit faster. You will probably create and burn some calories, etc. So the idea there with multimodal travel is a particular technology that's called mobility as a service, which we launched earlier this year in the UK, which essentially is an app that what they do is they combine the different data sets from all the modes of transport. So it's not like what Google does or Citymapper does right now, which is like, I want to go from here to here, and they give you the options. What multimodal, it will be combining the information to say what do you prefer? Do you want to move faster? Do you actually move healthier? Do you want to save money? And through those settings that are customizable, we will provide that information. The second one is about remote working and underutilized resources. This is helping us to ask why people move, really, systemically, why people need to move. So what if we could create a platform between employers and employees where they start to use underutilized resources such as cocktail spaces, restaurants, those are plenty in that area of Brooklyn, for them to go and work there. How much it will take to capture from those 225,000 people that are moving all the time, let's say a little more than 10%, 25,000. How big is right now WeWork has around 50,000 people, just over 50,000 people in New York. So that's roughly half of the footprint of WeWork. What do we need to do to really do that? So we're working there with a startup. And so before we go there, entrepreneurial and neighbor communities, this is more like open, almost like a hub, a space where you provide the information, the data, the tools for citizens to start to say, hey, I have this problem, and you potentially haven't seen it. How can I create a solution with all the data that we already have and all the tools? So Dell is a key partner there for us and really trying to provide that space. And then the final one is strategic planning and real-time pedestrian data, a key part of the data for planning better the routes. Because at the moment, there are a lot of almost like estimations and assumptions how people are going to move in the different kind of routes that are going to exist. So how can we capture how people move before and after, and use that data to do strategic planning on how the routes need to be allocated? But essentially for us is really use that model to amplify it to support Mission Zero. Have you heard about Mission Zero? Yes, one no, plenty of no's. Mission Zero is the goal from different cities to reduce fatalities and accidents in terms of urban transport. So within that, how can we help and support and create a model? Big question there for us is privacy and data. How you're going to capture that data, and that's a big challenge. Can we create a series of capturing sensors that share the information with government, but the ownership of the data is actually using and for the commons? That means for everyone. So that's a question that we're having there. And here you can see some of the specific partners, but one thing that's probably very important to mention, given what we just heard about the ecosystem, is we didn't say, let's start from scratch. We have these ideas, great. And the ideas were filtered through data and multiple conversations with stakeholders. What we did is, who is already doing something like that in the city that we can help and accelerate, that we can help and really foster that impact and catalyze that impact. And that was a fantastic journey, because that started to help us to really talk with different people and communicate with startups that are already doing that. So for example, the multimodal travel is already doing that, or they're based just here in Grand Central Tech. They have a multimodal API. Spacious and Dell remote working. Spacious is a startup that have over 1,000 or nearly 2,000 users that's doing that. They're underutilized spaces. How can we create and amplify that? The strategic planning and real-time data. A big question for EDC and DOT. And the entrepreneurial and neighbor communities, that's also something that we really want to kind of connect with other institutions. Nearly there. So who has joined? Probably I can share that later. This is the roadmap, but just probably to clarify a couple of final 2 points. So one thing that has been quite enjoyable for me in terms of being part of the project is really start to use this specific example so local to start to connect with the bigger picture. Why people move, challenge mobility from a systemic perspective, the interconnections among actors, which goes back to the ecosystem. The future of the mobility in the industry is going to be massive, so it's going to change, and every single member of mobility is actually, they believe that 40% of how the industry is operating right now is going to change hands by 2030 because autonomous vehicles, connected, electrification, shared vehicles, etc. And then scale and replication, no? So how can we replicate this in other cities? Just jump in that. So the 3 emergent learnings again: systemic ventures, map the ecosystem, and act. Any questions? So we'll have it in a minute, but thank you very much.
Thank you. UNDP already works with many of those tools applied to support, for example, the government of Macedonia and the city of Skopje to address the complex problem of air pollution, and playing very much a similar role in bringing together different actors and thinking through different parts of the system. And as we roll out the country support platforms, such elements of thinking through different levels of a system element, and particularly drawing upon the expertise of new actors, is going to become increasingly important. What we really wanted to do is not only provide here some tools and systems thinking, some theory, but an applied example in New York City, where most of you, myself included, live, and also with a strong focus on tapping into like new solutions, and that I think is quite important, being open to reframe problems. So not only say, how do we move people from A to B if they can't move anymore with a train, but also thinking through, why do they move in the first place? Are there alternatives to moving at all? And I think that is something we can really learn from. And to kind of conclude, to me, this is just a testament, an example in practice of thinking in a larger system and then formulating a couple of testable hypotheses of, if we do this, those will be the effects on the system. And personally, I think we would be well advised to lose some of our overconfidence we have in theory of changes and rather handle, assumptions of effects on larger systems and test them as a portfolio of ever-evolving experiments. But with that, the floor is open for questions. If you could just state your name and where you work at, so our presenters know where you are. And we are over time, so if you want or need to leave, no problem at all. This is now just another extra 10 minutes, but if you have to go, no problem. And the floor is open. Anyone have any questions to Lily or to Rodrigo?
Maybe we
Yes,
covered
please.
everything.
Hi, thank you to us for interesting presentations. I have a question for the first one. I was wondering if you have any data on gender and any patterns that are related to the. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a fair question, and something that is really, really important to me or us. But unfortunately, both in Nairobi and Bangalore and all of these places, I think you see where I'm going. Like the sample size of female entrepreneurs in the tech sector is so incredibly small that it's very hard to surface any kind of trend, which speaks for itself as a problem.
Yes, please.
Yeah, a question on the incubator aspect. My name is Daniel. I live in Lagos, Nigeria, and run a co-working space. And I really do think you say that a lot of, I think we see in Lagos, probably see in Nairobi, that a lot of the incubators, they don't really have a lot of impact, and a lot of the problems that they're solving are not really problems that locally need to be solved. But I think a lot of that goes into, and Nairobi is a good example of a lot of donor funding going in, and they're trying to solve problems that are decided beforehand. So if you're looking at changing the model, who would you say has a responsibility to change it? Because the thought would be, do they not accept the donor funding that's committed to certain goals and that?
Yeah. That's such a good question, and I actually wanted to touch on it as I was going through the social network maps. We just talked about this with Benjamin, and we did some of the research in Lagos, which I want to add is a slightly better performing network than Nairobi, because actually the successful entrepreneurs do a ton of give back and
Exactly.
and investing. I think I would go back to two things. So one of the important things that happens in networks is a lot of imitation of behavior that is considered to be successful or good behavior, prestigious stuff. And it all goes back to, okay, if the most influential organizations are grant funded and people connect with people who have similar backgrounds to them, and the grant funded organizations hire people from Columbia University, SIPA, they're also going to give to expats with no experience in entrepreneurship. And it's very much happening. I think for that, the responsibility lays with the donor to hire people who are either, like in Nairobi and Lagos, fully possible to find the founders of Andela or, iRocco or whatever in Lagos and be like, would you be interested in joining our board of directors or giving some of your time to mentoring entrepreneurs?
To add to that, because there's always kind of a dichotomy between being a successful business but also solving the problems that need to be solved. The idea here is that if your business is solving the problems that need to be solved, but it exists in this framework of not thinking about it as a business and having to reach scale, that's kind of the problem. Like, these businesses will benefit a lot more from mentorship and investment from people who've helped companies reach scale successfully than this kind of same cycle.
Are there any more questions? Then I'd say for the interest of time, we take one more and then we close it. Please.
Hi, my name is Ashura, and thank you again for the presentation. My question is for you, Rodrigo. You said one of the important things was scale and replication. So I'm wondering, in replication contexts are really important. You yourself mentioned LA as well as Paris facing a lot of problems, and we end up usually getting bogged down by context a lot. So I'm wondering, in your example and your experience, how are you dealing with that complexity?
Yeah, essentially the element of context and geography, and the differences of that. Yeah, I think that's a key part of us, that we are thinking about it in a very open way and flexible. Is going to be very different. I mean, the context of here, you have a couple of rivers, you have to cross the river, etc. In LA, the context is completely different, and that's something we really want to figure out in the documentation of, if context is important, what are the elements of that context? So are we talking about geography? Are we talking about which behaviors? How many people, for example, are moving in cars? How people move in LA is super different. So it's almost what we're trying to start into question is how you almost kind of create a taxonomy for context and what it means. And then, so therefore that helps you to start to kind of, okay, this context is different for these and these and these reasons.
Thanks also for that question. One of the things we try to underline with the innovation facility, with increasing the other parts of UNDP, is there are no best practices to address complex problems. And we are well advised to kind of think through how do we best adapt, best understand context. And that is something that in mainstream development is fortunately changing, also with the advent of the Sustainable Development Goals that are very much based on systems thinking. And therefore, replication might not be the applicable term, unless you think about not scaling a solution, but scaling processes. If you scale the process of, we want to listen to citizens, we want to identify the problems, then if you replicate those processes, have been proven successful. Yeah. I think there's a difference. Yeah. And that's something I think we got to think through more about, not only scaling a vertical solution such as M-Pesa that has been really transformative, but thinking through what were processes that enable M-Pesa to be generated in the first place. So with that, a big thanks and an invite to the last innovation conversation in 2018, next Monday. It's International Human Rights Day. It's the end of the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. And we are having 5 amazing speakers with us who all present new ways to address gender-based violence by using new data, a colleague from Global Pulse, by using experimentation and behavioral insights, a colleague from Behavioral Insights team, financial vehicles, including investment vehicles to address GBV, a colleague from the Criterion Institute, and a colleague from the New York Public Policy Lab that redesigns public services with survivors of gender-based violence and also perpetrators. And it's going to be in the other building And you are very much invited to do the track to DC1 next Monday. An interesting event. And otherwise, thanks so much for coming. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And thanks, colleagues online.
Thanks, Hamza.
Thank you, everyone online, for pairing with us.
Bye.
Sorry again.